represent a large number of GPs, LPs who are looking at investing on the regulatory, legal, and tax aspect. So, and I've been in this space for over 2 decades now. So it's a space which I kind of really passionately work for and with as a lawyer, and I enjoy the way the industry is kind of shaping up.
So in that time, I assume you've seen sort of funds, meaning mutual funds, and now sort of more alternative funds. Tell me, just out of curiosity, in other markets, the regulators have sort of created 2 categories of investors. In India, we have created 3 categories of pooled vehicles in a way: mutual funds, PMS, and now AIF. Do you have any insights as to why the regulator decided to take this approach rather than the more?
So I think the fundamental difference in our framework compared to some of the global regulatory framework for asset managers is they regulate asset managers and not the funds. India has taken a slightly different approach where you regulate funds. And in some cases you may regulate asset managers, but they are kind of not necessarily the exclusive regulators for that. So in that scenario, each of the asset classes had to be kind of given their own set of frameworks. So mutual fund, traditional asset class needed public, accessible to public, so it had to have a very different kind of framework for that. But I think alternative investment funds, and I think that's really where today the growth and the buzz is all around, when to the extent that people are saying whether at some point alternatives will outpace the traditional asset class like mutual fund. And I think that's been a very significant evolution if you look at it. And to a great extent that change is driven by policymakers. So when they moved from an erstwhile venture capital fund, I mean alternative asset was synonymous with VC till 2012, to from there to what we see today as AIF, 3 categories covering asset class right from an early stage venture fund or an angel fund all the way to large hedge funds and anything that goes in between. So I think that framework, open architecture kind of a framework of alternative asset has really led to the growth of this asset class in India. And it's, in my view, still the tip of the iceberg. We're still going to see a lot more in terms of institutional capital, both domestic and international, which will kind of significantly add to the assets under management for AIFs.
So do you see the categorization, the 1, 2, and 3 evolving? How do you see that changing going forward?
So I think, yes, within the 3 categories buckets, I think there's still enough flexibility for new asset classes to be brought in. So for example, credit as an asset class was probably not as clearly envisaged when the framework was being put in place, but it has very well kind of fit within the category 2 AIF. Similarly, I think we will see more of the other asset distress fund, for example. Again, the architecture is open, so it allows. So I don't see immediately any change or a need for a change on these categorization. Yes, we are talking about slightly different vehicles, like permanent capital vehicles, and for which we may have a different framework coming in. But I would think today it's kind of self-sufficient in many sense, the framework.
Let's talk about, I guess, the investors that are coming into AIFs. How has that changed? I mean, are you seeing new kinds of investors coming in, both domestic and overseas?
No, I think I would say in my over 2 decades of experience in dealing with this industry and the investors looking at this asset class, that's been the biggest change. And it's quite amazing to see how it has transformed over the last 5 years or so, where a lot more institutional capital is now coming in. So traditionally, I think the initial growth came from primarily HNI, ultra HNI individuals, family offices to a small extent. But the last 5 years, the growth has really come in from large institutional capital. And when they look at a country, a macro of a country or asset class, they have a very different perspective, much longer term perspective on India. And that is what India as an emerging market needed. So that, I think, you talk about the Canadians, you talk about the GCC sovereign funds or Singapore sovereign funds. I think they are betting bigger and bigger on India. And I think that really makes this even more exciting in many ways from an offshore capital perspective.
How are they behaving differently in the way they negotiate their terms with the GPs?
So I think each of them are global allocators of capital, highly experienced, and in many sense they are also as experienced in dealing with India. So many of them either have their own presence on the ground, they are very attuned to what the market is. So what they are asking for is not very different from what they would negotiate with any other global GPs. So I don't think they use too many different parameters to negotiate terms.
That's compared to their global investments. But I'm talking about from a GP point of view, Indian GP, they were used to dealing with HNIs who may not have done that much due diligence, right? So the level of due diligence.
Yes, so I think that's also kind of a factor which is leading to maturity in the GP investor base. It's a completely different ballgame when you're negotiating with an international DFI or a sovereign fund or a large family office overseas. So the terms that you ask for, the negotiation on those terms, which were virtually absent when you deal with an HNI segment. So people have to kind of be more transparent, be willing to kind of offer a better governance to some of these LPs because they look for that. I don't think they really necessarily squeeze you on economics as much, but they definitely want your interest to be fully aligned, and I think that's really where the GPs see the difference. Key person clauses, management fee with a budget, those are things which traditionally domestic LPs, and maybe because they were not matured enough to do that, I think those are terms which kind of extend your negotiations, fundraising, but give you an LP which will possibly back you not for this fund but for years to come. So they are willing to invest that kind of effort in that.
I think one of the things that extends the fundraising term is the lack of standardization of data, performance disclosures. I don't know for the life of me why they don't comply with GIPS standards. I mean, CFA has already these standards around. So do you have a view on that?
So I guess that's something which is currently being pursued by SEBI as a regulator, and I think to an extent one could appreciate where the regulators are coming from, where they want some degree of standardization.
But why do we wait for the regulators? I mean, why does the regulator have to step in and define for mutual funds or for AIFs? Why does the industry bodies, why does IVCA or AMFI not do it?
No, I think it's something which the industry bodies kind of recognized, that the industry, I mean, if you talk about alternative as an industry, it's probably less than a decade old if you in a mature terms. So it's always good, I mean, whether the framework should precede the business or the business should grow and then the framework. So it's a classic chicken and egg. Maybe we now have a critical mass. We now have 550 odd AIFs. There needs to be a standardization. Maybe organization like IVC and others need to play a more SRO kind of a self-regulatory organization role, and which is what MFI has done for mutual fund. So I guess it's kind of moving in that direction. There is a definite push as well from the government and the policymakers to kind of move it to a level where there is more disclosures, more transparency, performance parameters are more well defined. So I guess it's part of any evolution of an industry. So I would be a bigger proponent of there has to be an industry first for it to regulate. And I think maybe we've allowed that. Now it's time to focus more on qualitative growth rather than quantitative. I mean, both are not necessarily mutually exclusive.
Okay. And your feedback on IVCA, what work they have done,
So I think IVCA, my association with IVCA goes back almost since the time it was formulated, close to about more than 15 years plus. And I think it's really evolved itself as a true representative of the industry. And I think the fact that they are recognized by policymakers, regulators as a representative body for the industry, and their engagement on policy initiatives very clearly demonstrate that they are really doing good for the industry in terms of bringing issues out to the policymakers, evolving new frameworks. So, as a part of that, I mean, I have personally been very active with several of their initiatives, and the receptivity that you see with the policymakers and how they view alternative or PE industry per se, I think today is really a outcome of a lot of effort put in by IVCA. So I think they've done a great job, institutionalized themselves. So it's a body which is now not driven by an individual, and I think it's really evolved significantly in my view.